Hello, and welcome to Bio 100. My name is Ben Bramall. I'm a biology professor here at Asbury University, and I'll be your instructor for this particular class. This is our non-majors biology class, and so this class is designed for students who have little or perhaps no knowledge of science or biology, and the class is designed to give you knowledge about science and in particular biology that will be useful to you as you go through your life and as you pursue whatever particular discipline you have chosen to pursue. Biology is the science of life. It's the study of all living things. And so certainly science in general and biology in particular are useful to all of us as human beings, given the fact that we are living organisms, and the science of biology really helps us to understand our bodies as well as the world around us. And so, in this particular lecture, we're actually going to focus more on science and what is science as opposed to the subdiscipline of science, biology, that's the overall focus of our course. So, this chapter will be a little bit different than many of the chapters that follow during the course of our class. We begin, as would be appropriate, with a brief description of what is science. And so, interestingly, it seems a little bit childish perhaps to talk about the scientific method, but really it's impossible to describe science without talking about this method. And so it is appropriate to describe science as a method of obtaining information. It's an empirical method that relies on testing. In other words, we're very interested in science in data. We accept the fact that opinions exist, and we're in no way claiming that science is all that exists. In other words, the supernatural does not exist. But within the realm of science, we do recognize that our scope is somewhat limited. We're limited to topics that we can perform tests and collect data on. And so we'll be talking a great deal about that during the course of our class. Interestingly, science is not this static body of knowledge, but rather is this method of obtaining information. This is very important because it helps us distinguish something especially important in our world today. What information falls into this realm of science and what information does not. It's unfortunate that in our world today, we're constantly bombarded with information that masquerades as science. It claims to be science, but it's not. One important thing to bring up, I feel like, at the beginning of our class is the idea of critical thinking. And so we're going to talk about, this seems like perhaps a childish thing to say, but what we're going to do is talk about a number of famous scientists during the course of our class. Essentially, this biology class is providing to you information on everything that has been discovered, all the really big discoveries that have been made in the course of the subdivision of science biology throughout the course of human history. And so, of course, it's our role to talk about a number of very famous scientists and what they discovered, and that's what your book essentially does. And what you'll find is that those famous scientists were very critical thinkers. They tended to be skeptical of information that was presented to them and not accept it at face value, but rather think about that and question it. If it didn't seem right to them, they performed tests. It's not that they rejected it without data, but rather they went and investigated to see if they if the information presented to them and accepted at the time was actually correct. So I typically use these kind of silly pictures that we have up on the screen here in this introductory lecture. And so these are magazines that, of course, I've seen, as you probably have, throughout the course of your life at a grocery store, Dollar General or Kroger. I think they're still there. And as we look at these headlines, a few of us would be willing to accept the fact that Clinton adopted an alien baby, or this world's smartest ape goes to college. But it's interesting, if we look at our society today, we really struggle with determining what is science and what is not science. The pandemic has really brought that to the forefront, and you'll hear a great deal of discussion about that today, including among very prominent scientists. I encourage you to look at some of the recent comments that Francis Collins, head of the National Institutes of Health, has made regarding this issue. Not angrily, but very patiently, and we're really in a position where we need our society to understand and have some acceptance and trust of science. So some examples of the issues that we struggle with occur on these slides. Here's a website that tells us that nearly two dozen medical studies prove that vaccines can cause autism. This is an interesting and perhaps never more relevant than today topic that we struggle with in our society. You see some very well known people down there in the right hand corner, a few of which promote this idea that vaccines are linked to autism. And interestingly, there's all sorts of, it's possible to have any sort of opinion on this particular topic, but if we look at the science, if we look at the data, the studies that have been conducted, what we find is that there are no studies that draw a link between vaccines and autism after a huge number of studies in hundreds of thousands of data points trying to establish this sort of relationship. But that, what I just presented to you, that there's no evidence that there's a link, doesn't stop this idea from widely circulating in our society today. Here's another one: genetically modified foods. And so there's a great distrust of genetically modified organisms in not just our society, but especially European society and other parts of the world today. So interestingly, so much so that Cheerios a number of years ago, they stated that they were GMO free. Whether they had any GM products in them to begin with is controversial, and you could Google that, and there's a number of interesting articles concerning that. But the significant thing is that there's enough distrust in our society that this company that makes this very widely consumed cereal thought it would be a good PR move for them to say they are GMO free. And so what we notice is that in our world today, the vast majority, over 90% of the corn, if we look at the bottom right-hand slide on our side of our slide, over 90% of the corn grown in at least America today is genetically modified. And there are reasons for that that we'll talk about later in our class. There are very few genetically modified animals that are approved for human consumption. In fact, the only one currently approved by the FDA in the United States is the salmon, the Atlantic salmon that's shown on the left-hand side at the bottom of our slide. And so here's the deal with genetically modified organisms. They are extremely easy to make today, given the recent advances in this technique referred to as CRISPR that you probably heard of. The Nobel Prize was given for it in September of 2020. And it is there are a tremendous number of advantages that are provided by these genetically modified organisms, both in terms of the environment and particularly in feeding people who, unlike us in a very privileged society where few of us, relatively few of us, have to deal with food shortages. But genetic modification technology allows us to provide food potentially for parts of the world that are much less stable. And so the leading scientists, Francis Collins and others, make this argument that, well, this problem that we have in developed societies with genetically modified organisms is problematic, not for us, but for less fortunate societies in the world today, where the turning our backs on this technology is going to make it much more difficult for those people to obtain things as simple as food or vaccines are another interesting one. The genetic technology potentially makes the production of vaccines much, much easier. So in summary, what we do at the beginning of our class is just to make a note of the importance of science, and particularly in determining what is science and what's not science in our world today. With that, we're going to go on and talk about the scientific method, and that's going to occur in the second lecture that appears in our course.